The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo.
Chapter 12. The Office and Limitations of the Reason. If the reason is not the sovereign master of our being, nor even intended to be more than an intermediary or minister, it cannot succeed in giving a perfect law to the other estates of the realm, although it may impose on them a temporary and imperfect order as a passage to a higher perfection. The rational or intellectual man is not the last and highest ideal of manhood, nor would a rational society be the last and highest expression of the possibilities of an aggregate human life. Unless, indeed, we give to this word reason a wider meaning than it now possesses, and include in it the combined wisdom of all our powers of knowledge, those which stand below and above the understanding and logical mind, as well as this strictly rational part of our nature. The spirit that manifests itself in man and dominates secretly the phases of his development is greater and profounder than his intellect, and drives towards a perfection that cannot be shut in by the arbitrary constructions of the human reason. Meanwhile, the intellect performs its function. It leads man to the gates of a greater self-consciousness, and places him with unbandaged eyes on that wide threshold where a more luminous angel has to take him by the hand. It takes first the lower powers of his existence, each absorbed in its own urge, each striving with a blind self-sufficiency towards the fulfillment of its own instincts and primary impulses. It teaches them to understand themselves and to look through the reflecting eyes of the intelligence on the laws of their own action. It enables them to discern intelligently the high in themselves from the low, the pure from the impure, and out of a crude confusion to arrive at more and more luminous formulas of their possibilities. It gives them self-knowledge and is a guide, teacher, purifier, liberator. For it enables them also to look beyond themselves and at each other, and to draw upon each other for fresh motives and a richer working. It strengthens and purifies the hedonistic and the aesthetic activities, and softens their quarrel with the ethical mind and instinct. It gives them solidity and seriousness, brings them to the support of the practical and dynamic powers, and allies them more closely to the strong actualities of life. It sweetens the ethical will by infusing into it psychic, hedonistic, and aesthetic elements, and ennobles by all these, separately or together, the practical, dynamic, and utilitarian temperament of the human being. At the same time, it plays the part of a judge and legislator, seeks to fix rules, provide systems and regularized combinations, which shall enable the powers of the human soul to walk by a settled path, and act according to a sure law, an ascertained measure, and in a balanced rhythm. Here it finds after a time that its legislative action becomes a force for limitation, and turns into a bondage, and that the regularized system which it has imposed in the interests of order and conservation becomes a cause of petrifaction and the sealing up of the fountains of life. It has to bring in its own saving faculty of doubt. Under the impulse of the intelligence, warned by the obscure revolt of the oppressed springs of life, ethics, aesthetics, the social, political, economic rule begin to question themselves, and if this at first brings in again some confusion, disorder, and uncertainty, yet it awakens new movements of imagination, insight, self-knowledge, and self-realization, by which old systems and formulas are transformed or disappear. New experiments are made, and in the end, larger potentialities and combinations are brought into play. By this double action of the intelligence, affirming and imposing what it has seen, and again in due season, questioning what has been accomplished, in order to make a new affirmation, fixing a rule and order, and liberating from rule and order, the progress of the race is assured, however uncertain may seem its steps and stages. But the action of the intelligence is not only turned downward and outward upon our subjective and external life. To understand it and determine the law and order of its present movement and its future potentialities. It has also an upward and inward eye and a more luminous functioning, by which it accepts divinations from the hidden eternities. It is opened in this power of vision to a truth above it, from which it derives, however imperfectly and as from behind a veil, an indirect knowledge of the universal principles of our existence and its possibilities. It receives and turns what it can seize of them into intellectual forms, and these provide us with large governing ideas by which our efforts can be shaped and around which they can be concentrated or massed. It defines the ideals which we seek to accomplish. It provides us with the great ideas that are forces, ideas which in their own strength impose themselves upon our life and compel it into their molds. Only the forms we give these ideas are intellectual. They themselves descend from a plane of truth of being where knowledge and force are one. The idea and the power of self-fulfillment in the idea are inseparable. Unfortunately, when translated into the forms of our intelligence, which acts only by a separating and combining analysis and synthesis, and into the effort of our life, which advances by a sort of experimental and empirical seeking, these powers become disparate and conflicting ideals, which we have all the difficulty in the world to bring into any kind of satisfactory harmony. Such are the primary principles of liberty and order, good, beauty and truth, the ideal of power and the ideal of love, individualism and collectivism, self-denial and self-fulfillment and 100 others. In each sphere of human life, in each part of our being and our action, the intellect presents us with the opposition of a number of such master ideas and such conflicting principles. It finds each to be a truth to which something essential in our being responds. In our higher nature, a law; in our lower nature, an instinct. It seeks to fulfill each in turn, builds a system of action round it, and goes from one to the other and back again to what it has left. Or it tries to combine them, but is contented with none of the combinations it has made, because none brings about their perfect reconciliation or their satisfied oneness. That, indeed, belongs to a larger and higher consciousness, not yet attained by mankind, where these opposites are ever harmonized and even unified, because in their origin they are eternally one. But still every enlarged attempt of the intelligence, thus dealing with our inner and outer life, increases the width and wealth of our nature, opens it to larger possibilities of self-knowledge and self-realization, and brings us nearer to our awakening into that greater consciousness. The individual and social progress of man has been thus a double movement of self-illumination and self-harmonizing with the intelligence and the intelligent will as the intermediaries between his soul and its works. He has had to bring out numberless possibilities of self-understanding, self-mastery, self-formation, out of his first crude life of instincts and impulses. He has been constantly impelled to convert that lower animal or half-animal existence, with its imperfect self-conscience, into the stuff of intelligent being, instincts into ideas, impulses into ordered movements of an intelligent will. But as he has to proceed out of ignorance into knowledge, by a slow labor of self-recognition and mastery of his surroundings and his material, and as his intelligence is incapable of seizing comprehensively the whole of himself in knowledge, unable to work out comprehensively the mass of his possibilities in action, he has had to proceed piecemeal, by partial experiments, by creation of different types, by a constant swinging backward and forward between the various possibilities before him and the different elements he has to harmonize. It is not only that he has to contrive continually some new harmony between the various elements of his being, physical, vitalistic, practical and dynamic, aesthetic, emotional and hedonistic, ethical, intellectual, but each of them again has to arrive at some order of its own disparate materials. In his ethics he is divided by different moral tendencies: justice and charity, self-help and altruism, self-increase and self-abnegation, the tendencies of strength and the tendencies of love, the moral rule of activism and the moral rule of quietism. His emotions are necessary to his development, and their indulgence essential to the outflowering of his rich humanity. Yet is he constantly called upon to coerce and deny them, nor is there any sure rule to guide him in the perplexity of this twofold need. His hedonistic impulse is called many ways by different fields, objects, ideals of self-satisfaction. His aesthetic enjoyment, his aesthetic creation, forms for itself, under the stress of the intelligence, different laws and forms. Each seeks to impose itself as the best and the standard, yet each, if its claim were allowed, would, by its unjust victory, impoverish and imprison his faculty and his felicity in its exercise. His politics and society are a series of adventures and experiments among various possibilities of autocracy, monarchism, military aristocracy, mercantile oligarchy, open or veiled plutocracy, pseudo-democracy of various kinds, bourgeois or proletarian, individualistic or collectivist, or bureaucratic, socialism awaiting him, anarchism looming beyond it. And all these correspond to some truth of his social being, some need of his complex social nature, some instinct or force in it which demands that form for its effectuation. Mankind works out these difficulties under the stress of the spirit within it, by throwing out a constant variation of types of character and temperament, types of practical activity, aesthetic creation, polity, society, ethical order, intellectual system, which vary from the pure to the mixed, from the simple harmony to the complex. Each and all of these are so many experiments of individual and collective self-formation in the light of a progressive and increasing knowledge. That knowledge is governed by a number of conflicting ideas and ideals around which these experiments group themselves. Each of them is gradually pushed as far as possible in its purity, and again mixed and combined as much as possible with others, so that there may be a more complex form and an enriched action. Each type has to be broken in turn to yield place to new types, and each combination has to give way to the possibility of a new combination. Through it all there is growing and accumulating stock of self-experience and self-actualization, of which the ordinary man accepts some current formulation conventionally, as it were, an absolute law and truth. Often enough he even thinks it to be that, but which the more developed human being seeks always either to break or to enlarge, and make more profound or subtle in order to increase or make room for an increase of human capacity, perfectibility, happiness.